Second recording. Let's go get started. Like I said, hopefully this doesn't take too terribly long. If it's gonna let me navigate. There we go. Okay, so chapter 3, we're gonna be talking about history. So family histories, political histories, all that fun stuff. So how does history interact with intercultural communication? Well, just if we look at the world, we can say a lot, because there's always a history behind everything. You know, if we just look at the US, in the past 150, 200 years, how many different groups have come in? You know, there was, the No Irish Need Apply with all the Irish immigrants. You know, we didn't like the Chinese immigrants when they first came over to build the railroads. You know, now it's the immigrants from Central and South America and the Middle East that people don't tend to like. And they didn't like the Italians either when they first started coming over. So history definitely affects how we communicate with other people and how they communicate with us and how we build relationships. So humans are storytelling creatures. We do this. It's just pretty natural for us. You know, you sat down at the dinner table when you were a kid and people asked you, so what'd you do at school today? Because they expected a story of the experience that you had at school that day. So it's very fundamental to us being human. That's what part of makes us human, is we tell stories, we interact, we build societies. And histories are stories that we use to help make sense of who we are. So, our history as Americans tells us who we should be as Americans. What we know of the history of other places tells us what we should think about who others are as well. But we can't escape it because it's already happened. It affects us no matter what. So the easiest way is to recognize history. Don't suppress and say, yes, this happened, and maybe it was really good that it happened, or maybe it was terrible, but we can't change it. So we need to do better and move forward. If it's something, negative. So if we ignore history, we can sometimes come to bad conclusions about other people or reinforce stereotypes. So you have different types of histories within the overarching history of the world and of different people. So you have political, intellectual, and social histories. You have individual family histories. You have national histories of nation states, and you have specific cultural group histories. And we will go into each of these more in detail, so if you are taking notes, these will come back again. So political, intellectual, and social histories. So our histories influence how we view things. Obviously, like our culture influences how we view things, and history is part of our culture. So the history that we know and our views about it are influenced by our culture. So pretty much anyone in the world can tell you a couple things about American history. So pretty much anyone in the world can tell you something about the Revolutionary War in the 1700s. However, how we feel about that particular instance is influenced by our culture. Obviously, we as Americans feel probably pretty positively towards the American Revolution. We're like, yeah, screw the British, we're free. Woo! Dump some tea into the harbor, right? Doesn't mean that the British feel the same, or the French feel the same about that particular instance, or China feels the same, or people from China feel the same about it, because their culture affects how they see that. That's kind of, to be more specific with things like that, terrorist or freedom fighter. Were we terrorists or were we freedom fighters? If you ask the British back in 1814, they'd probably say, no, you Americans, you were probably some terrorists. obviously we would call ourselves freedom fighters. But obviously this can cause some barriers to communication if you maybe disagree about these historical instances or how you see them. But everyone does have different viewpoints, so we just have to kind of work around that. We have to communicate with people. So specifically, our political histories are histories that focus on political events. So most of the histories that you read in school are political histories because they're histories of political decisions. Splitting from the United Kingdom was a political decision. Pretty much anytime you pick up a social studies textbook from middle school or high school, they're political histories. Because that's what's important. It's the borders, it's how nations expanded, it's who was in charge of this country at this time and what decisions that they made. You have intellectual histories, so histories that focus on the development of ideas. So how did we go from rock tablets to papyrus to leather skin to printing press to mass-produced books? That might be an intellectual history looking at how ideas or technology developed. Social histories, so everyday life experiences of various groups. So if you have a book about what daily life was like for a peasant woman in France in 1643, that would be a social history because it's looking at the everyday life of a particular group of people, women in the Middle Ages in France or whatever. Or what was life like for the Jews that came over after World War II in the US? What was life like for insert whatever group here? But it influences how we understand who we are as people, how we fit into our family, as members of different cultural groups of being German American, or being LDS, or being insert whatever here that we are. And as citizens of our own nations. If you're American or Canadian or Mexican or El Salvadorian or insert whatever here. So we also have family histories. So the personal histories of our family, the people who are related to us. So obviously family history occurs at the same time as other histories. So Pilgrims on the Mayflower, 1621, William Brewster. That is part of my family history. That is also part of our national history because that is what started the settling of the United States. But we have those individual family stories that are passed down that aren't in the history textbooks because, not everyone is related to William Brewster, even though a lot of people are. Puritans were pretty prolific. But then how might our knowledge about who our family is affect how we think we are or how we should be? Because our families might have certain expectations of us that we might not fall under. Because, we're different people. We don't have to be exactly the same as them. But do their beliefs about how your family should be or ought to be change how you feel about yourself or the perception that you have? We have our national histories. Obviously, nations, you have China that's been around for 5,000 years as a nation state. So their textbooks probably leave out a lot. Do our textbooks leave out anything? But national histories, they tend to cover great events, so like the Louisiana Purchase, George Washington becoming president, stuff like that. I haven't been in a history class in a really long time, so I don't know. But talk about important events and important people, but it gives us this shared notion or this shared narrative of who we are as Americans or who we are as Canadians or who we are as insert whatever nationality you happen to be. and it helps solidify our sense of nationhood and patriotism. But how do the stories that we tell ourselves about our national identity, reflect upon us? There's lots of things that history textbooks leave out, especially ones that, we look at in middle school and high school. I do not teach history though, so please take the things I say with a grain of salt. But unless you go do academic research into history, there's probably a lot of things that we don't actually know about American history, like Columbus Day. So we typically get a day off for Columbus Day, right? They don't put in a lot of the textbooks that they would chop off the natives' hands if they didn't bring them enough gold, right? Not something that you'd be like, woo, let's celebrate that. But do we, as Americans, and I say this as Americans because most of us in here are born and raised in America or have been here a very long time. But do we learn much about the history of other nations or other cultures? Did you guys ever have a class on different cultures?
Not really.
Yeah, not really. We might have learned a little bit about Canada.
Yeah, I was about to say, I had world history a lot, and I would study and write research reports on specific cultures and religions, but I never had an entire class dedicated to one specific culture other than US American history.
Anyone else in here take world history? One person sitting in the classroom. But I think the last time I took world history was 6th grade. Yeah. Paige, your connection is not great at all.
Oh, no, that's not me. I don't know who that is. But I was going to say, I've taken Western Civ, so I learned about European history my 9th and 10th grade of high school. And then my 11th grade, I went into American history.
So we got a couple people in world history and then a Western Civ. So learning about Western culture. You don't often see Eastern culture classes. Talk about classics in Eastern, like how medicine started in the Middle East. That's the reason that we know that you can not die if you wash your hands and stuff. Yeah. We have our cultural group histories. So your subcultures, or I guess just cultures within a nation. So you might all be Americans, but we each have a different cultural identity. So mine is German American. My first ancestor came to the US, William Brewster, on the Mayflower, but more recently, most of my family has come over from Germany. But, we're Kansas Germans, we're Volga Germans. So we're a very particular type of immigrant. But obviously I'm still an American, so I share that, but my culture group in Kansas has a very specific other culture that we have our own cultural dishes, our own cultural history, stuff like that. But they are a subset within national. So you have national, you have cultural, and you have family and personal and stuff like that. But if you are ignorant of how different cultures have interacted in the past or different ways that they might do things, it can make misunderstandings more likely to happen. So if you don't understand, the relationship between the Orthodox Jews in New York and how they interacted with the mainstream Christians when they first came over here, then you might cause some misunderstandings or accidentally cause offense. You have racial and ethnic histories. I'm trying to think of like what order of hierarchy these would go in, because some of them are very like closely related, because you could think of as like Jewish as like a cultural history, but you could also think of it as like an ethnic history, but also like a religious, because it depends on who you ask. So, but obviously our mainstream history cannot include everything about ethnic and different racial histories, because especially in places like the US, it is so diverse. You know, you can't cover everything. Your brain probably just does not have the space for it. But, you know, if you don't have some of these taught in schools, then people might lose some of their histories. I think that's why you've seen like a resurgence recently with like Native American schools. I had a student talk about that last semester, where, you know, they were taught like the Apache language and Apache history and customs and traditions in school, so that they would not lose that ethnic, that cultural history that they had. And because these stories are not always mainstream, sometimes events can get swept under the rug. I'm sure most of us know about the internment camps in the US after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Americans, their stuff was taken. A lot of it was sold. People did not often get their stuff back, and they were put literally into internment camps, which is just a nicer name for a slightly nicer concentration camp. You know, except there were no gas chambers. They weren't being killed. They were just held there. So it was all right, quote unquote. I mean, it's something we learn about now because, you know, that is an important part of American history that we can't ignore, but it's probably not the most popular thing to talk about.
It reminds me of the saying, like, history is written by the victors. And so it's like there's some things that it's like if they don't really want to like think about it, they're like, but we were the good guys, that it does just kind of get swept away.
Yeah, I think an important thing to remember is that no one thinks that they're the villain, whether that be on a national scale or even a personal scale. Like, no one thinks that they are the bad guy. So, you know, people might say, well, you know, obviously it wasn't comfortable for them, but it was important. Like, we had to protect ourselves. It's still not a right thing to do, but no one thinks that they are the bad guy. And you will learn that in personal relationships too, that, you know, no one thinks that they are doing evil. So probably none of you guys are old enough to remember post 9/11 the treatment of Muslims here in the United States, or people who even disagreed with Bush at the time, or people who didn't want to go to war. They were not treated very well. I mean, I remember a little bit of that. I'm not too much older than you guys, but I remember my mom, just when conversations like that would come up, she would just stop talking because she didn't think that we should go to war. Obviously, you know, it was a horrible thing what happened, but, you know, is that, like, is there a better way to go about taking care of something like that rather than invading multiple countries and treating your fellow Americans of a different religion like crap? So there's even some people who try to deny the Holocaust and sweep that under the rug, which is actually a crime in Germany, by the way, in case you didn't know. But history is somewhat written by the victors, unless you can get someone who out there is willing to give out their side of the story and explain the injustices that is happening to them. You have gendered history, so history of women, men, people in the in-between, but just cultural conventions of how things are maintained, how they're altered, particularly in the West. So histories of women as told by women rather than as told by men is more of a recent phenomenon. Obviously, there have been women authors and academics throughout the entire history of the world, but typically you've seen more men in those professions telling their stories rather than women telling theirs. But sorry, I'm trying to remember where I was going with this, but I lost my train of thought because I was thinking about internment camps. But how is contemporary life today influenced by our gender history? So if you guys even think it is. There's actually a really interesting article on the BBC the other day about the designer Coco Chanel and how she was really like the first one to design clothes like as a woman for other women rather than men designing clothes for women. And it was just a really interesting read to see about how men design clothes for women, like for women to look attractive. Like, you know, the corsets, you know, push everything up and in, versus Coco Chanel's a little bit more boxy, a little bit more free-flowing clothes. But interesting article. You have sexual orientation histories, so histories of the LGBTQ community that until recently tend to have been overlooked or silenced. So the Nazis did not only just hate the Jews, they hated the disabled, they hated anyone who was LGBT. I think most of them were Protestants, so they might not have liked Catholics either. It was one of the two. They were either Protestants or they were Catholics and didn't quite like the other one. The AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, Abraham Lincoln sexuality. But we need to understand that, you know, some of these things are not a recent phenomenon. Like, there's always been issues that people have swept under the historical rug to say that, oh, well, these people didn't exist. You know, we didn't have, you know, there were no LGBT people in the 1800s. Yes, there was. Oh, you know, there were no women doctors in, you know, 2000 BC. Yes, there were. But it's just, do they often have a chance to get their stories told? No, not often, because typically they have less power to get those stories told. But we can miss good historical lessons if we don't want to realize that these things, you know, they are a part of our history, a history of the world, a history of the US, you know, our own family, our own personal histories. Diasporic, so histories of immigration. So a diaspora is a massive migration. So you had like the Irish diaspora after the potato famine caused by famine. Currently, you could say we have like a diaspora fleeing like South and Central America from all like the gang wars and stuff. That is a massive migration of people fleeing persecution, enslavement, famine, war, civil unrest. But it's a dispersal of a unified group. So like a Jewish diaspora, the Jews leaving Europe to flee persecution by the Nazis or flee persecution by the Catholics or whoever it was at the time. Because it's been different people throughout different times. But it helps us understand the connections among people that are affected by these grand migrations. But are these connections helpful or hurtful? So we just have to use our best judgment on that. What slide are we on? We have about 10 minutes left. Maybe I can get this done. You have colonial histories. So America has we're not huge colonialists, but we have definitely done it. Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. Where else do we own that's like not technically a state? I mean, Hawaii's a state, but.
We already said like Puerto Rico, but there's a couple other Virgin Islands.
The U.S. Virgin Islands. Oh, I always forget about them. Who owns the Cayman Islands? Is that the British? I don't know. But the British have like a huge colonial history. The Spanish, the Portuguese, Russia technically colonized Crimea in 2014, annexed. But international invasions, annexing countries, saying, this is mine now. Like, sorry, Jake, that's not your wallet and phone anymore. It's mine. I have used my power of being able to conquer to take what I want. But people might have colonized other countries from overpopulation. Like Britain is a very tiny island that has a very large population and not a lot of resources. So they colonized other places to get resources. Notions of grandeur, I don't know if you guys were taught like in high school and stuff, why the Spain and Portugal were really good at colonizing. Gold, God, and glory. So gold for the royal treasury, God to spread Catholicism, and glory because they had notions of grandeur. But colonialism, so who colonized you determines the language you speak. So we were colonized by the British. We speak English. We were, Quebec colonized by the French. They speak French. Well, they speak Quebec, whatever it is. I don't know. But the rest of Canada was British. They speak English. Brazil, Portugal. They speak Portuguese. The rest of South America, Spain. They speak Spanish. Is it like the Philippines or something that also speaks like a form of Spanish? Because they were colonized by Spain too? Tagalog or something? Or maybe I'm thinking of Samoa. I don't know. But yeah, there's places all over the world that speak quote unquote random languages because they were colonized. So like I think Mozambique speaks French in Africa because we're colonized by the French. Maybe it's Portugal. I don't know. You'd have to look at a colonization map. But post-colonialism, so we're pretty much in that stage right now in most of the world. Like Britain has given up most of their colonies, like they've given up Vietnam and stuff, or Vietnam might have been French. India was British, Vietnam was France. But how do we come to terms with bridging both of those cultures? Like for places that have just been uncolonized in the past 50 years, how do they rebuild their culture? How do they come to terms with, who they are as, Vietnam or India, like post-British rule or post-French rule? And then of course has socioeconomic. I really wonder what slide we're on. Okay, we're on 18 to 22. I don't know if we're gonna be able to finish that or not. Yeah, we're gonna stop at the socioeconomic class histories just because we're not gonna be able to do that. I will finish that out on Tuesday before we talk about the other thing, the ethnography.